Evening, everybody. Good afternoon, rather. I'm speaking today to Dr. Frans Cronje, and he was formerly involved with the Institute of Race Relations, and now he's involved with another think tank in South Africa, I believe, or economic group. And topic of today actually is a plan to end load shedding. So, Frans, welcome to this channel.
Yeah, hi, Hugo. Nice to be here.
Thank you. So, I want to question you on it's an interview I saw with you with Alec Hogg a few months ago, and you made a provocative statement that South Africa can end the worst of load shedding within 18 months.
Yeah.
Now, is that even feasible?
Yeah, it's not too hard to do. It's amazing what happens if you actually go to the data and do
Yeah.
some research and understanding why there's load shedding and what the options are to escape.
Mm.
So, let's start somewhere near the beginning. We produce in South Africa at the peak hour of a peak day. Let's say depends when in February, first quarter, when we started this, I can't remember, 24,000 megawatts of electricity. Okay. Now, load shedding, which is a South African thing, the electricity gets turned off on a sort of rotating schedule around the country. That gets done in stages. And one stage is equal to 1,000 megawatts.
Yeah.
So if load shedding is, let's say, at stage 4, which is kind of where it is at the moment, that means that had we produced 4,000 more megawatts, all things being equal, it's not exact, but it's close enough, then the lights would have been on around the country, and from an electricity perspective, things would have been better. So when we were producing 24,000 at a peak hour, if we'd been producing 28,000, then the lights would have been on. So that's how to understand how to get out of load shedding.
So I want to just break that down. So because you work in megawatts, I work in gigawatt. That's 1,000 difference. South Africa, as I understand it, you mentioned it's 24. So I was a gigawatt, 24,000 megawatt. And you're saying we only need 4,000 in addition to that to basically break even.
This was Q1. We started this. This was a document we produced on load shedding and getting out of it. And we averaged production numbers in the first quarter of the year. And yeah, essentially, had you produced 4,000 more megawatts, wouldn't be load shedding. And that's roughly true. It's true today, still give or take a bit. If we, through the peak hour of a day, can comfortably produce another 4,000, the lights would be on. I mean, the lights are on. That doesn't mean there's much happening by way of growth or this isn't. One thing about present day South Africa is relativism. Is South Africans learn in the relative order of things what is important, and having electricity on becomes important. The next step, let's go to the next step, and then we'll come back to what we need. Let's say we want to grow the economy and create jobs. South Africa's unemployment rate's very high. More than half of young people don't have a job. Okay, so very high. There was an era when the country created quite a lot of jobs, and that was in the first decade after it became a democracy, between 1994, 5, 6. Let's say after the Asian financial crisis, about 98 and 2007, South Africa almost doubled the number of people in employment.
Yeah.
And its government of the era never got the credit for that. I mean, in the local business press, even to today, that era is described as an era of jobless growth, which is just an aside warning on where you get your information from before you think through.
It's quantitative analysis about South Africa is severely lacking in these.
Really, and that's going to be the point of our chat today. Is if you do the quantitative analysis of electricity, you realize there shouldn't be load shedding, and it should be pretty easy for it to be done away with.
Let me tell you how I look at it. So I came to a conclusion that South Africa needs about 15 gigawatt to grow the economy. Okay, 4 to end load shedding. Yeah, that's more to keep the lights on. To say, I came to a conclusion about 11 to 15 depends who you ask. Okay?
We're going to tell you. I'm going to tell you now. It's very interesting you say that. So we did this, obviously independently of you, because I've never spoken to you until about 3 minutes ago. So we said, all right, if we want to grow the economy, how much do we need? And we said, well, let's look at a period of 10 years, year 1 to year 10, and we want to sustain economic growth rates that are comparable to emerging markets. So that means aspiring to 4%, 5% growth. We reckon that in year one of that, from an energy perspective, I mean, there are a lot of other policy reforms that also need to happen. Just let's take the energy ceiling out of the equation. In year one, we'd need to produce about 31,000 megawatts in the peak hour of a peak day. So I told you we're currently at about, when we started this analysis, quarter one of this year, 24,000. If we'd gone up by 4 to about 27, we wouldn't have had load shedding. We need to go up by further 4 to about 31,000. Mm-hmm. And then from an energy perspective, you can see how growth becomes possible. And the way we did that is we went back to previous eras, and we looked at the relationship between electricity production, consumption, and economic growth, job creation, compared that to other emerging markets, and factored in growing energy efficiencies, and we got to this number. So year one, it's 31,000. Year 10, it's 45. So we reckoned we needed to go up by between 12 and 15. You said 11 and 15. Okay. That's very interesting.
Okay, that's interesting because I work in the energy sector, and this is more or less the numbers we do. And I've got a much simpler way of doing it than you do. We don't do complex anacronyms. I just look at the US energy consumption. South Africa has to double and double again. Okay, but because of energy efficient technologies, you don't have to go that far high. That's more or less we will get you.
So far, this is pretty interesting because we're in the same place.
Okay, so we
thought in 5 years is possible.
Yeah,
and without building another power station or putting up another power line, it's possible. Now, how did we get to all of this sort of magical stuff? Because it's so different to the mainstream that you hear of. We went back and we looked at what electricity generation infrastructure the country actually has. And if every power plant and thing that makes electricity worked at the maximum of its capacity 24 hours a day, 24/7, which obviously is not possible. But if that happened, we'd produce in the peak hour, peak day, 50-something thousand megawatts. Now, of that 50 that we could produce, about 45 of that related to coal infrastructure, coal plants. But of those coal plants, so 45,000 of coal potential, of that 45,000, in the first quarter of this year, only about a third of that, just more than a third, was functioning and operational. So, and if you therefore just put this on the charts, it's visual, you can see it. You've got this vast pillar, which is coal, 45,000 potential. It's producing a third of that. It's about 15, and everything else is really small. There's like 2 of nuclear, and there's a bit of wind and solar, and pumped storage schemes, and imports from our better governed neighbours, and who are able to generate sufficient surplus to export to South Africa. I was recently in Zambia, and it was really cool because we were in a place, and the Zambian quite enjoyed telling the South Africans that in Zambia the electricity is on 24 hours a day.
Yes.
Which
I look at it, so let me back off a little bit to see how I look at the bigger problem. When I look at poverty, I go on the work of Charlie Robinson, who is a specialist on emerging markets like you. And he wrote an interesting book a few years ago where he said you can look at 3 factors in terms of poverty. Literacy is number 1, undoubtedly. Second one is the standing of women, particularly the fertility rate. That's usually a proxy for the percentage of women society. And the third one is electricity. South Africa has the first 2 factors ready. So is Morocco. So is Egypt. They achieved it under Mubarak, not Sisi. That's why those economies are growing. What South Africa lacks for economic growth to be on a path, which I would say Asian tiger path, New Deal, whatever you want to call it, it's just electricity.
Quite right. Yeah, I mean, I'm quite optimistic on South Africa's prospects as a country. I think people are getting the downside wrong. If you remove this electricity constraint, growth outlook for South Africa could be very, very...
But there's one other constraint which I think is being neglected a little bit, is water. Okay, South Africa ran out of water in 2008 for industrial purposes, but we still have drinking water. Now, my answer to that is, and I'm biased because I have a qualification in nuclear, is build nuclear power stations tomorrow around your coast. Just throw the concrete. It takes about 10 years if we're really honest about the numbers. It's a bit late. Maybe the LCOE is not perfect. Build it around the coastal cities and for the purpose primarily of desalination. It allows inland rivers to recover. That will even increase the coal efficiencies. And then the second one I want your view on is, are you in favor of building new coal power stations or just upgrading the current ones to helical?
Okay. Your nuclear water idea is interesting. I hadn't heard that before. Let me quickly take you back to our 45,000 of coal. So let's remember what we're at. There's a lot of numbers going on here. Q1, South Africa, the peak hour is producing 20-something thousand megawatts. If it had produced 4,000 more at the peak hour, it wouldn't have had load shedding, and 4,000 beyond that could aspire to emerging market growth rates. Over 10 years, it would need to up production from about 30 to about 45,000 megawatts. So it needs to add about 15. It has potential to produce 50, but half of that doesn't work. And of the 50 potential, 45 is coal. And of the coal, only just over about a third of that was functional. So one of the things we did as we set out to find a resolution to load shedding is we talked to some Eskom people, current and former. And what was immediately striking, they're very nervous about talking about, and you think, this country that has major electricity problem, these are people who work in the industry or did work in it, and they'd be forthcoming. And they were very much, you've got to, what I'm going to tell you, you've got to protect me. Well, what dastardly thing is going on here? And they said, listen, those coal plants that aren't working, the 30 of the 45, the structures are solid. There's nothing wrong with them. They've reached the end of their life, yes, on paper. And if we were a sort of modern, well-run industrial economy, they'd probably have been decommissioned and something else would have been built in their place. But they're solid. What's wrong in them was explained to me, and they made it nice and simple so I could understand it, is inside the boilers. There are boilers, you can try and imagine what a boiler is, and lots of pipes and gauges and valves and taps and things. And these things, some of these things are decades old, have been corroded. And some of them have been looted and a little bit have been sort of hacked off to steel for scrap metal. They said, do this, send in a team of auditors into every boiler with a blueprint, and they must go and look at what is going on inside there. And where they find a corroded pipe or valve or something, they make a note that we need to order this from the original equipment manufacturer, if they're still around, or we need to make it. And if we can't make it in the country, and there was a nice argument on some industrial action inside the country by making this stuff, order it from someone that can make it. And with all these parts assembled, they said you send in some engineers into that boiler and they take out the broken pieces and they put back in the new pieces. And one chap said to me, you can light it up. It's going to work. It's not pretty, but it's going to work. And I said, well, how long does this take? And the view was, well, if you do it, China did it. Take a very short period of time. Shouldn't take more than 3 years to refit a power plant. And one of the pieces of advice that we produced was refit a third of the coal fleet. And that's about 15,000 megawatts of potential. And no power source works at 100% of its potential all the time. They have different sort of factors at which they operate. And refurbished coal shouldn't strive, and you're more expert than me, but shouldn't struggle to do 70, 80% of its potential. So that would immediately put back 11 or 12,000 megawatts into the grid within 3 to 5 years. So I'm pushing my 3 years to 5 now because South Africa doesn't always do things in the most efficient manner. If you do that, and you have coming online a lot of solar, which is very good. I mean, my whole South African life is powered by solar. on people's rooftops and small businesses and the like, and perhaps we put in another gas turbine or two, you very quickly get to the 15,000 figure that our report felt was necessary to aspire to emerging market growth rates. And we've therefore, this was done through a small policy group that I happen to chair called the Social Research Foundation. And it provides advice and information to diplomats, political party leaders, parts of the government, and business leaders. And it doesn't seek any great prominence or so. Its purpose is to give high quality advice. Our advice was surprising, perfectly feasible that by the first quarter of 2024, South Africa is out of load shedding just by doing this. And within 5 years, you in selling the country around the world, promoting its interests, going on all these investment tours that the government's so fond of, you can, with great confidence, say that if you follow the strategy, then South Africa will cease to have an energy cap, an electricity cap on its economic growth potential.
So a few things there that I just want to comment on. The idea of retrofitting plants is not a new one. France, we've been doing it now with our nuclear fleet because they're also coming to the end. Many of the European countries built in the 80s, they planned it a little bit better, but they were also lazy. It's lacking. South Africa, a little bit better, but there was a period where Holland made a commitment to end nuclear and they fired the engineers, and then they had to retrain them, but now they've got them back on track. So France's availability factors are also sloping down a little bit, and we're now going to rebuild 6 nuclear plants. Okay, South Africa doesn't have nuclear that quantity; they have coal, but it's the same principle. Okay, you can inspect them and you can do it. And the advantage in South Africa is, unlike France, you don't have to turn them off; they're off already, so you can do it much quicker. To speak to your point over there, where I didn't feel like I saw a lot of comment on yet is, yes, people can bring solar into the country. And I think rooftop solar is now running at 4 megawatt. And I think I saw an article the other day, there's a 4 gigawatt, and there's 10 gigawatt of renewables installed, but I don't know what capacity factors they're all, because they're all over the place. But we've got some renewable coming in. But what I'm still not clear on is the integration costs of the renewables in South Africa's grid. Because whoever you ask, it seems to get a political answer. Do you have any idea if they are going to be cheaper, or if they're going to increase the rates as we saw in some countries in Europe?
I don't know, but we have been in some of these conversations. You won't have much trouble, other than the political trouble, in getting private investors. And it's not necessary to do this privately. It's quite cheap to refit the coal. The state could do it out of the budget, all on its own, and maintain its Eskom monopoly in it.
Yeah.
But you get a lot of private interest in refitting the coal. When on the renewables, there've been a lot of kind of moments in meetings where, if you say, would you do this without subsidies, or either domestic or from the European Union, the people bringing the renewables in say no, they wouldn't, because it wouldn't work. It's not viable. And I think the South Africa's right to obviously lift all its caps on private energy production. But if you want to get into that market and you want to produce, you need to do so on the merits of on the business merits of the case. And for the time being, I think it's going to be very difficult to beat coal on price. There's another argument on renewables. We drew out the grid capacity data for the country. So that's how much space is there on power lines to transmit electricity around the country. And running from the west to the east, there's essentially zero. And that matters because the west is the zone of higher solar radiation. And I've been in some of those conversations where, as a precursor to building solar, new grid needs to be built first. And that's nuts, because there's vast surplus grid capacity that runs from the north towards the south, because that's the grid that was built for the old coal infrastructure, 2/3 of which is now defunct. So you can imagine how much grid capacity is defunct. And if you consider how solar energy works, you're not producing a constant sort of amount of electricity 24/7. You produce a hell of a lot at noon, and then it's less around that. To transmit that, what you are producing requires great new grid investment beyond what you do if you were to, for example, build a coal plant out in the west of the country, which you wouldn't do. But just to make that point, and also you've made the point on capacity factors. Now, capacity factors is the kind of number I quoted earlier on coal. That a coal plant, refurbished coal plant, should run at a capacity factor of about 70-75%, which means exactly what it means. Renewables in South Africa, capacity factors are going to be way below, about a third of that, if we do well, about 25. That means you need to build 3 times as much renewable infrastructure to produce the quantum of electricity that a refurbished coal plant would produce. But you're producing that if you drew a chart through 24 hours of what your solar plant's producing, you producing the vast majority of that in the middle of the day. Storing it from a cost perspective isn't yet competitive. And therefore, to fuel industrial growth, it's really hard to make the case that a transition that's a leap from coal and shutting off the remaining coal to solar works. And there's also a moral component to this argument, which I think needs to be highlighted more often. That half of young people in South Africa don't have a job. They have no prospects of improving their lives. Living standards in poor communities that rose very quickly in the decade after democracy are deteriorating again. And I've spent some time in the US, which is where I talked to you from today, and the centerpiece of both current American and European Africa policy is green and just transition stuff. And it's a misalignment with the strategic interests of Africa's people and African governments. And frankly, any African government that took its energy advice today from Brussels or Washington would undermine its economic competitiveness, reduce the living standards of its people, and raise the prospects for political instability in those countries. They just can't follow that advice, which isn't true for the advice they get from Russia and China, for example, which on energy is very much more sensible. And it almost comes down to a kind of Western cultural evangelism, that it's acceptable to go to Africa and tell the Africans to turn off the most efficient power sources that they have, and regardless of the consequences. And I don't think this is a zero-sum game discussion, and I don't think the advice we offer to the South African government to refurbish coal is a question of locking the country into a long-term coal future. I just think Africa should be, and South Africa should be given a long lead in time to transition out of coal to cleaner energy sources.